The snowstorm raged outside, its howling winds lashing against the walls of Jack Carter's cabin like a wild beast determined to break in. Snow piled against the windows, a white curtain sealing him from the world beyond. Jack sat alone in the soft glow of the fire, its flames casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. The cabin was quiet, save for the occasional crack of a log in the hearth and the groaning wind outside. He wrapped his calloused hands around a steaming mug of coffee and leaned back in his armchair, letting the warmth seep into his bones. It had been 3 days since the storm rolled in, 3 days of utter isolation. But Jack didn't mind the solitude. He was used to it. Since retiring from the fire department 5 years ago, Jack had lived in quiet retreat deep in the Colorado wilderness. His cabin sat miles away from the nearest town, a sanctuary carved from the forest where he could live free of sirens, smoke, and the relentless call of duty. The silence that once unsettled him had grown into a kind of companion, a constant presence, gentle and undemanding. But that night, something changed. A sound cut through the quiet like a blade. Scratch. 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 Jack froze. He tilted his head slightly, holding his breath. The wind? No, this was different. Rhythmic, deliberate. He sat up, placing his coffee down on the side table and listening again. The sound came again, softer now, almost hesitant, followed by a faint, desperate whimper. He stood, the floor creaking beneath his weight as he walked cautiously toward the front door. His instincts, sharpened over decades of emergency calls and near-death experiences, flared to life. Every step was measured, alert. He reached the door and peered through the frosted glass. His breath caught in his throat. There, barely visible in the swirling snow, stood a German shepherd. Her fur was coated in frost, her frame trembling violently against the brutal cold. She was hunched low, her body curved around 2 tiny figures pressed tightly against her chest. Puppies. Jack's eyes widened. The dog looked up. Their eyes met. Her gaze was filled with something Jack hadn't seen in years, pure, raw desperation. Not fear. Not aggression. Just pleading, exhausted need. Jack's hand hovered over the doorknob. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. She could be rabid. She could be lost, maybe even dangerous. But none of that mattered. Because something in those eyes pierced straight through his armor. He opened the door. The wind surged into the cabin like a beast unleashed, biting and frigid, carrying flakes of snow that danced like shards of glass. The German shepherd didn't move. She stood still, rooted in the snow, guarding her young. Her breath came in short, visible puffs, and her ribs pressed sharply through her sides. She was starving. Barely surviving. And yet she had made it this far. "Come on, girl," Jack said softly, crouching down. "You'll freeze to death out there." The dog whimpered, shifting slightly, her eyes darting between Jack and her pups. One of the pups took an unsteady step forward, then collapsed in the snow with a soft whine. Instantly, the mother picked it up by the scruff, took a shaky step into the doorway, and looked back for the second pup. That one followed, clumsily, falling against its mother's leg. Jack stepped aside. As they crossed the threshold, Jack quickly closed the door, sealing out the storm. The sudden warmth hit the dog like a wave. She stumbled, her legs buckling, and collapsed onto the wooden floor. Jack grabbed a blanket from the couch and gently draped it over her. She flinched. But when she saw that he wasn't trying to hurt her, she let out a long, trembling breath and lay still. The pups clung to her belly, noses searching for warmth and milk that her failing body struggled to provide. Jack knelt beside them, stunned. They looked like they had been through hell. The puppies, barely days old, were so frail he could count the bones in their tiny frames. One of them made a weak squeaking noise, the other buried its head into the mother's side, trying to nurse. Jack reached out to check them, but the dog let out a low, warning growl. Not hostile, just protective. All right, Jack said, hands up in surrender. You're a good mom. I get it. He stood, crossed to the kitchen, and returned with a bowl of warm water. Placing it gently beside her, he stepped back. She looked at the bowl, then at Jack, and after a moment's hesitation, lapped it gratefully. Jack watched silently. His mind was spinning. Where had she come from? How long had she been out there in the storm? What kind of monster leaves a mother dog and her pups out in weather like this? Whatever her past, she was here now. And for reasons he couldn't yet explain, that meant something. "You've got a fighter's heart," Jack said under his breath, almost to himself. "I know the type." He sat down in his chair again, fire crackling, the room warmer now not just from heat, but from the presence of something alive. Something meaningful. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But he knew this: she had come to him for a reason. And he wasn't going to let her down. The next morning, the storm had calmed. Outside the cabin, the world lay buried under a thick, untouched blanket of snow that glittered beneath the weak morning sun. The storm had left its mark, a jagged landscape of drifts and broken tree limbs. But inside, warmth glowed from the fireplace, and something deeper had begun to take root. Jack stirred on the couch, stiff from a night of uneasy sleep. His eyes flickered open, instinct pulling his attention toward the hearth. The German shepherd lay there, curled protectively around her two pups. The fire had burned low, but the cabin held enough warmth to keep the icy claws of winter at bay. The pups squirmed faintly beneath their mother's chest. One let out a tiny yawn. The mother's ears twitched at the sound of Jack moving, her amber eyes blinking open to meet his. Still cautious, still guarded, but not as sharp with fear as the night before. "Morning, girl," Jack said quietly, rising to stretch. His bones creaked in protest, reminders of years spent carrying lives out of burning buildings. "You all made it through the night." She watched him warily as he shuffled to the kitchen. He rummaged through the pantry. No dog food, obviously. He hadn't had a pet in years. He pulled out a can of chicken soup, popped it open, and warmed it on the stove. "It's not much," he said, pouring it carefully into a shallow bowl. "But it's warm and full of salt and fat. That's gotta be worth something." He placed the bowl near her again and stepped back. She sniffed the air, her nose twitching. After a moment, she leaned forward and began to eat, slow at first, then hungrily, as if her body remembered its needs all at once. Her pups stirred again, one pawing at her side, the other trying to crawl closer. Jack knelt a few feet away, watching. "You're tough," he said softly. "Bringing those pups through that storm? That's more than most could do." The mother paused her eating to lick one of the pups clean. It was such a tender, instinctual act that Jack had to blink away a sudden stinging in his eyes. He'd seen a lot of pain in his life, a lot of loss, but there was something about this quiet fight for survival, this silent love between mother and child, that dug deeper than anything he'd faced in the line of duty. The pup let out a high-pitched whimper. Jack instinctively reached toward it, forgetting for a moment how protective the mother had been. Her growl came quickly, not a snap, not violent, but enough to freeze him in place. "Okay," he whispered. "I hear you. No touching the babies." He stood and stepped away, heart pounding a little from the intensity of her stare. Still, there was no hatred in her eyes, just warning, just love. Jack looked around the cabin. It suddenly felt smaller, more alive. The silence he'd once cherished was now filled with soft breaths, tiny yips, and the creaking sound of a living presence beside him. He walked to the closet and pulled out a few old towels, laying them beside the fire. Then, careful not to come too close, he gestured toward the new bedding. "Come on over here, girl. A little more comfort for those bones." She didn't move. So Jack sat down across from her, back against the couch, letting her get used to him. Time passed slowly. The fire crackled. The pups mewed softly. He sat without speaking, letting the hours stretch long and quiet. Eventually she shifted. Nudging one pup with her nose, she stood on trembling legs, padded slowly toward the towels, and settled down again, closer to him now. Jack exhaled slowly. That single act of trust warmed him more than the fire ever could. By midday, the clouds had parted, and the sun poured weakly through the windows. Jack stepped outside to fetch more firewood. As he opened the door, he glanced back. The German shepherd lifted her head, eyes tracking his movement, but she stayed put. The pups were dozing against her stomach, safe for the first time in who knew how long. The snow outside was deep. Jack trudged to the woodpile and filled his arms, then returned quickly to the warmth of the cabin. He checked on his guests again before stoking the fire and settling into his chair. The dog's eyes followed his every move, but the suspicion in them was beginning to fade. "Maybe we start with names," Jack said aloud that evening, spooning a can of beans into a pot. "I can't just keep calling you girl. Doesn't seem fair, not after everything you've been through." She looked up but didn't react. "How about Grace?" Jack tilted his head. "Yeah. You look like a Grace. Strong. Gentle. Fierce when it matters." He looked down at the pups. "You too," he murmured. "You need something just as solid." He thought for a while, watching their tiny bodies shift and breathe. "Snow," he said finally, pointing to the lighter one. "And you, Ash. Fitting for little fighters born in a blizzard." He smiled to himself. Grace blinked slowly, head resting on her paws. She didn't know her name, not yet. But she would. In time. Later that night, Jack sat near the fire with a bowl of stew in his hands. Grace was curled up beside her pups, now nestled together on the makeshift bedding. Jack noticed something new: she wasn't watching him anymore. Not with fear, not even wariness. She was asleep. Deep, real sleep. Her body had finally accepted she was safe. Jack leaned back and stared at the ceiling. He hadn't asked for this. He'd lived a life full of fire and tragedy. He came here to escape all of it. And yet somehow, in this quiet place, this broken dog and her babies had found him. Had chosen him. He thought of the years he'd spent fighting to save lives, dragging bodies from burning homes, holding sobbing parents, covering fallen comrades with blankets as sirens wailed in the distance. He thought of how empty he'd felt when the uniform came off. And now here he was, holding a bowl of stew, watching a mother sleep beside her children, feeling something in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Grace shifted in her sleep, one paw twitching. Snow let out a small squeak. Ash wiggled closer to his mother's warmth. Jack didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know if Grace had run from someone, or if she'd been abandoned. But he knew this much: she wasn't going back to the cold. Not on his watch. He grabbed a pad of paper and began scribbling a note to the local vet. He needed advice. Food. Medicine. A checkup for the pups. He wasn't just sheltering them anymore. He was taking responsibility. Outside, the wind had died down, but the cold still lingered. Inside, the fire burned steady and warm, shadows dancing along the walls. Jack looked at Grace one more time, then whispered the only promise he knew he could keep. "You're safe now. I've got you." The wind had finally settled. In the early hours of the morning, a weak sun peeked through the bare trees beyond the cabin, casting long golden slants through the frost-laced windows. Inside, the silence was sacred, a different kind than before. Not the empty kind Jack had grown accustomed to in his solitude. No, the silence was full. It breathed. It had weight. It was the kind of quiet that settled deep into your chest and reminded you that you weren't alone anymore. Jack rubbed the sleep from his eyes and rolled his shoulders. The old aches crept in like clockwork, sharp little reminders of ladder climbs and years in a body that had seen too much fire. But he didn't complain. He didn't even grunt. Because the moment he opened his eyes and saw Grace still curled around her pups by the fire, he remembered why he was here. Why he hadn't just let her freeze to death on the porch. Why it all mattered. The pups stirred. Snow gave a soft squeak, flailing a tiny paw into his sister's face. Ash yawned wide enough for her entire face to wrinkle. Jack chuckled quietly and stood, padding over to the stove to warm the soup again. He didn't have dog food, but Grace didn't care. The way she had devoured that bowl yesterday made it clear she wasn't picky. She was a survivor. She'd have eaten rocks if they were warm. He poured the soup into a pan and stirred slowly, listening to the gentle sounds of life growing around him. Grace's eyes fluttered open as the scent of food filled the room. She lifted her head and sniffed the air, then looked toward Jack. No growl. No tense shoulders. Just a tired mother still learning how to trust. That was progress. "Morning, Grace," Jack said gently, placing the bowl a few feet from her. "It's not steak, but it's warm." She rose slowly, careful not to disturb the pups too much, and padded over. She was still unsteady, but she was moving better today. Jack watched her ribs flex with each breath. Malnourished, underfed, worn out, but alive. And still standing. He watched as she licked the soup with slow, grateful laps. Every move she made was purposeful, conserving energy, doing only what was necessary. She wasn't just surviving for herself anymore. Jack stepped into the hallway and pulled his old corded landline from the wall. He hadn't used it in weeks. Cell service was spotty out here, and he didn't bother with it much unless he was expecting something. But today, he needed help. He thumbed through the dog-eared phone book until he found the local vet clinic. He dialed, the rotary clicks echoing against the walls. A woman picked up after the second ring. "North Ridge Veterinary, this is Megan." "Hi. This is Jack Carter. I live up past Mile Creek Ridge. I've got a situation." "Go on," Megan said patiently. "I found a dog. A German Shepherd. She showed up during the storm. She's in rough shape, ribs showing, exhausted. And she's got pups. 2 of them. Just days old by the looks of it." Megan's tone shifted instantly. "Is she eating?" "Yeah, soup. It's all I've got." "That's fine for now. Can you bring them in?" "We'll make room." Jack exhaled, tension draining from his chest. "Yeah. I'll get them loaded up. Might take a minute, she's protective." Megan chuckled softly. "She sounds like a good mom. We'll be ready." When Jack hung up, he turned back to the living room. Grace had finished the soup and was now licking Snow's tiny ears clean. Her movements were slow, but full of care. Jack crouched down nearby, far enough not to crowd her. "All right, girl," he murmured. "We're getting you checked out today." Getting her into the truck was easier said than done. Grace didn't trust crates, and the idea of being moved at all clearly unsettled her. Every time Jack came too close to the pups, she placed herself between him and them, teeth bared, not in rage, but in pure, trembling fear. "It's okay," he said calmly. "I'm not going to hurt them. Or you." He moved slowly, wrapping the pups in a blanket first. Then he patted the soft folds, letting Grace see what he was doing. After a moment of hesitation, she let him lift them. Only then did she allow herself to be guided, carefully, toward the door and into the back of the truck. Jack drove slowly, tires crunching over the icy road, eyes constantly scanning the ditches and curves ahead. The storm had left trees bent and snowbanks like walls on either side of the road. But the roads were passable now. Grace lay in the back, pressed against the pups. Her eyes never left them. Jack glanced back through the rearview mirror every few seconds, checking on her. She didn't relax until they pulled into the gravel lot behind the vet's office. Megan met him at the door. She was mid-30s, freckles across her cheeks, eyes kind but sharp. A lifer in this business, Jack guessed. Someone who'd seen animals come in broken and leave whole again. He liked that. "Let's get her inside," Megan said, nodding to a tech behind her. They didn't use leashes or force. Everything was quiet, slow, reassuring. Grace growled once when a tech reached for Ash, but Megan held up a hand. "Let her see. Let her smell. You have to earn it." Eventually, they were able to examine all 3. The pups were underweight but responsive. Grace was malnourished, with light scarring along her sides, old injuries, likely from abuse or neglect. She's been through a lot, Megan murmured, fingers gliding over Grace's spine. But she's strong. And these pups? They've got a chance. Jack stood in the corner, arms crossed, feeling both proud and deeply helpless. Do you think she ran away? He asked. Megan looked up. Maybe. Or she was dumped. Dumped? Megan's mouth tightened. It happens more than you think. Backyard breeders use dogs like her until they can't anymore. When they're spent, pregnant, weak, scared, they get dumped. Sometimes they don't make it. Sometimes they show up at a cabin in the woods. Jack's jaw tensed. She's lucky, Megan added. You found her. Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. The knot in his throat was too tight. When they finished the exam, Grace was given fluids and a small starter pack of nutritional supplements. Megan packed some soft food and formula, just in case the mother needs help feeding them. They loaded back into the truck, and Jack made the long drive home in silence. Grace was tired. The pups slept soundly in the back. Jack kept glancing at them, heart full and hurting all at once. Back at the cabin, he settled them near the fire again. Grace didn't flinch when he moved the pups this time. She simply followed, curled around them, and looked up at Jack. And for the first time, just for a moment, her eyes softened into something else. Gratitude. Later that night, after the fire was fed and the house wrapped in shadow and warmth, Jack sat in his chair, his old flannel blanket draped across his knees. The pups lay on a bed of towels. Grace was nearby, curled beside them, her breathing slow and steady. He took a sip of tea and watched the flames dance. He had opened the door out of instinct. But somewhere in the middle of soup cans, soft growls, and tiny paw prints, he had begun to feel something stirring again. Responsibility. Purpose. Love. The days that followed unfolded like the slow melting of winter, measured, quiet, but full of transformation. Grace and her pups began to recover in a rhythm that Jack hadn't realized he needed. There was a peace in the repetition. Wake. Feed. Watch. CA. Re. He hadn't lived on a schedule since his retirement, but now his hours were no longer his own, and that suited him just fine. Each morning, the sun rose a little higher in the sky, painting soft, golden lines across the floorboards. Each night, the fire burned a little longer, its warmth no longer meant for just one man. Grace and the pups had made the cabin feel alive in a way that solitude never could. Grace's ribs were still visible, but the harsh outlines of her suffering began to dull. Her coat, once matted with ice and dirt, now carried the faintest shimmer under the firelight. She moved with more confidence, pacing the room without flinching, her ears perked at sounds rather than flattened in fear. Snow and Ash had begun to explore on wobbly legs, their tails little flickers of joy and curiosity. Jack made a point to sit with them on the floor every afternoon. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. He just let Grace come closer at her own pace. Sometimes she'd rest her chin near his boots. Other times she'd sit just out of reach, her eyes scanning his face like she was trying to read the contents of his soul. He let her. Trust wasn't something Jack expected overnight. He had learned the hard way, through failed rescues, through lives lost in the smoke, that trust was earned moment by moment, heartbeat by heartbeat. Grace was no different. In her eyes, he saw flickers of memories she couldn't speak, chains maybe, or cold cages. Hands that struck instead of comforted. She didn't bark. She didn't whine. But her silence was a language all its own. One morning, while Jack was preparing a warm mash of rice, broth, and shredded meat, Grace did something unexpected. She approached him. Not hesitantly, not with the caution she had shown before. She walked right up to where he stood at the stove, sat beside him, and looked up. Her amber eyes calm, open. Jack smiled. Well, look who's finally decided I'm not the bad guy. He bent down slowly, hand extended. She sniffed his fingers, then pressed her snout into his palm. Jack froze for a moment, overwhelmed by the trust in that gesture. Then he moved, gently rubbing behind her ears. "You're a good girl, Grace," he whispered. "You're safe now." That afternoon, Jack took them all outside. The snow had melted in wide patches, revealing the frozen earth beneath. The sun was warmer, and the sky was a vivid blue. Snow and ash bounded through the white, tumbling over each other, their tiny barks echoing through the trees. Grace walked slowly beside Jack, alert but not anxious. Her eyes scanned the tree line often, a flicker of old instincts still buried deep. Jack noticed it too, how her posture changed slightly the farther they wandered from the cabin. "Not too far," he said, kneeling to gather the pups. "Let's keep home close." Grace stood still, her eyes locked on the distant woods. Her tail dropped slightly. Then she turned back to Jack and followed him without a sound. That evening, Jack sat beside the fire, sipping his tea while the pups curled up at Grace's belly. She rested on her side now, completely relaxed, her body unguarded for the first time. Her breathing was deep, steady. Her eyes fluttered shut. And then Jack noticed something. A scar. Thin. Pale. Barely visible through the now glossy coat on her shoulder. He hadn't seen it before. Not clearly. But now it was obvious. A knife? Barbed wire? It didn't matter. What mattered was that it had healed. Just like she was beginning to. Jack leaned forward and gently placed his hand near her head. She didn't flinch. Instead, she shifted slightly and pressed her snout into his palm once more. "You're something else, Grace," he murmured. "Tough as nails. And soft as snow." That night, the cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the occasional soft sound of pup dreams, little barks and twitching paws as Snow and Ash chased something in their sleep. Jack didn't go to bed right away. He sat in his chair, staring at the fire, lost in thought. Something inside him had shifted. The days of quiet retreat were over. This wasn't just a rescue story anymore. It wasn't temporary. This was family. And family, Jack knew, came with responsibilities. The next day, he drove into town, not to the vet this time, but to the local general store. He bought real dog food, a leash, a set of stainless steel bowls, and a second-hand dog bed that he strapped to the top of his truck with old rope. The clerk gave him a strange look. "Didn't peg you for a dog guy," she said. Jack shrugged. "Didn't peg myself for one either." When he returned home, he found Grace by the window, her nose pressed against the glass, ears twitching. She wagged her tail. Just once, when she saw him. Jack unloaded everything and set it up near the fire. He placed the bed gently, smoothing out the surface. Grace patted over and sniffed it, then turned to him with wide eyes. "Try it," Jack encouraged. "It's better than the floor." She didn't move. So Jack sat on the floor beside the bed and waited. It took 5 minutes. Then 10. But eventually, Grace stepped into the bed, turned around twice, and curled into the soft cushion with a deep sigh. Snow and Ash climbed in after her, their tiny bodies burying into the folds. Jack sat back and smiled. This was home now. The following days brought more changes. Grace began to eat heartily. The pups grew stronger, more playful. Ash was bold and curious. Snow, though smaller, was fiercely determined, always trying to keep up. Jack found himself laughing more, real laughter that came from deep in his chest and echoed off the cabin walls. One evening, while chopping wood outside, Jack looked up to see Grace standing at the window again. Snow and Ash were at her feet, pawing at the glass. Jack waved. To his surprise, Grace's tail thumped once against the floor. That single gesture was enough to make his chest ache. When he came inside, she met him at the door, nose to his hand, tail wagging gently. It was the first time she had initiated contact. "You trust me now," he said softly. "Took a while. But we got there." He crouched beside her and scratched behind her ears. Snow barked once and tried to bite his boot. "Easy there, soldier." Jack laughed, nudging the pup gently. That night, they all sat together by the fire, Jack in his chair, Grace on her bed, Pups nestled in beside her. The cabin was warm, not just from the hearth, but from the presence of something bigger than survival. This was healing. This was grace. The days passed gently, marked by the steady rhythm of healing. Jack found peace in the quiet routines that now filled his life, preparing meals not just for himself, but for 3 hungry mouths, tending the fire with more care than ever before, checking Paws for frostbite, and watching Snow and Ash explore each new corner of the cabin with the awe of children discovering the world for the first time. There was laughter in the air now. A soft kind, often quiet and to himself, as Jack chuckled at Ash's clumsy bounds into overturned boots or at Snow's indignant yips whenever she was outpaced. Grace had settled fully into her role as their mother and protector, but even she had begun to show signs of playfulness, her tail wagging lazily when the pups rolled over each other, or her ears perked forward in amusement when Jack spoke to them as if they were guests at the dinner table. Jack started writing again. Old habit. Notebooks that had once sat untouched for years began to fill with scribbled pages. It wasn't poetry or fiction, nothing formal. Just thoughts. Observations. Emotions he didn't know he'd been bottling up. He wrote about Grace, how she watched the fire like it held answers, how she sometimes cried softly in her sleep, how she refused to eat until both pups had been fed. He wrote about Snow's fierce determination, Ash's tender loyalty, and about how his cabin, once a monument to loneliness, now felt like it had a soul again. He also wrote about fear, because it was still there. Even amid the warmth, Jack couldn't forget the look in Grace's eyes that day near the edge of the woods, the way her body went stiff, her head lifted, her growl low and primal. Something had been out there. And whatever it was, Grace had recognized it. That unease returned one afternoon. The snow had softened into wet patches, revealing the earthy scent of thawing forest. Jack had taken the pups out into the yard to stretch and play while Grace lay in the sun, eyes closed but always alert. Ash had wandered a little farther than usual. Jack didn't worry. He was always quick to come when Grace barked or Jack called. But this time, Grace didn't call. She stood. Suddenly. Sharply. Her body tense like a wire pulled tight. Her nose lifted, her ears shot forward. Her eyes locked on the woods. Jack froze. Snow yipped, confused, while Ash scampered back toward the porch, tail between his legs. "What is it, girl?" Jack asked quietly, reaching slowly for the axe still resting on the wood stump. Grace didn't respond. She was frozen, every muscle wound. Then she growled. Deep. Guttural. Jack turned his gaze to where she was looking. Nothing. Trees. Stillness. Snow. But he had learned to trust Grace's instincts more than his own eyes. He stepped forward, heart beating fast. And then he saw it. Just for a second. A figure. Half concealed in the shadows between the pines. Still. Watching. It vanished the moment he blinked. Jack scooped up the pups, called sharply to Grace, and backed into the cabin. He slammed the door and locked it. His hands were shaking. Grace paced in front of the window, tail down, eyes darting. It had been a man. Not an animal. Not some lost hiker. A man. And Grace knew him. Jack didn't sleep that night. He sat near the window, rifle leaning against the wall, Grace pressed at his feet. Her breathing was slow but shallow, like she was forcing herself to rest while every nerve in her body screamed for vigilance. The next morning, Jack called the sheriff's department. "Name's Jack Carter. I'm out near Mile Creek. Had someone lurking near the property yesterday." The deputy on duty, a woman named Miller, listened patiently. She promised to send someone out to check the woods and increase patrols. Jack wasn't reassured. Because deep down, he knew. This wasn't random. That night, Grace refused to sleep. She sat by the door, growling at every creak. Jack sat beside her. He didn't try to stop her. She was remembering something. And whatever it was trying to come back. The following afternoon, Jack took the photo he had snapped of Grace and the pups early on, back when she had still been too weak to stand without shaking, and drove into town. He stopped at the local shelter, a small building run by volunteers who knew nearly every dog within 50 miles. The woman at the desk was named Sarah. Kind, firm, tired around the edges. Jack handed her the photo. Found her during the storm. With pups. Figured it was worth seeing if anyone reported her missing. Sarah studied the photo, then sighed and shook her head. No reports. And I don't recognize her specifically. But we've had an influx lately. Abandoned dogs. Mostly breeding stock. Breeding stock? Sarah nodded grimly. Backyard breeders. Illegal or just barely legal operations. People who use dogs like her until they break. When she's too old, too sick, or too scared, they dump her. Especially when they don't want to deal with puppies. Jack clenched his jaw. She was dumped in a blizzard. Sarah's face tightened. Then she's lucky. Most wouldn't have made it. Yeah, Jack whispered. Most wouldn't. Back at the cabin, Grace met him at the door, her tail low but wagging once. She sniffed the grocery bags he carried and gave a soft bark as Snow tried to dive headfirst into the sack of dog food. Jack laughed and ruffled the pup's ears. But as the night fell, the laughter faded. The fire burned lower. The air shifted. He felt it before he saw it. Standing by the window again, Grace let out a low growl. Jack moved to the glass, careful not to breathe too loud. There, at the edge of the woods, was the man again. Closer this time. Jack's blood ran cold. He stepped back, grabbed the rifle, heart hammering. Grace moved to the door, teeth bared, every inch of her body ready. Stay back, Jack said softly. I'll handle this. He opened the door just enough to step onto the porch. The wind had picked up again, howling between the trees. Who's out there? Jack called. This is private land. You've got 5 seconds to turn around. No answer. Then a voice. Smooth. Cold. She's mine. The man stepped forward. Older than Jack expected. Late 40s. Dirty jacket. Rope in one hand. That's my dog, he said calmly. Been looking for her. Jack raised the rifle. She showed up here half dead. If you left her to die, she's not your dog anymore. She ran. The man replied. Got out. But she's coming back with me. The hell she is, Jack said, stepping forward. The man's eyes darkened. You don't know what you're dealing with. That dog is damaged goods. She's dangerous. Jack's voice went cold. She's a mother. And she's braver than you'll ever be. Behind him, Grace appeared in the doorway, teeth bared, hackles raised. The man flinched. Just for a second. She remembers you, Jack said. And she's not afraid of you anymore. The man's smirk faltered. He took a step back. You'll regret this, old man. Try me. Jack didn't lower the rifle until the man disappeared into the woods. When he finally turned back, Grace was still standing there, her body trembling, not with fear, but with rage. Jack crouched beside her. You're not going anywhere, girl. Not unless it's your choice. She leaned into his hand. A silent vow passed between them. Whatever happened next, they'd face it together. The next morning brought a silence that didn't feel safe. It was the kind of stillness that follows a warning shot, the eerie calm that settles before something worse moves in. The cabin, usually humming with the soft sounds of Grace and her pups, felt different. Tense. Wound tight like a wire ready to snap. Jack had barely slept. He sat at the kitchen table, eyes sunken, hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had long gone cold. Outside, the woods were quiet, but Jack's instincts were loud. He had spent a lifetime in emergencies. You don't do 3 decades in fire and rescue without learning the rhythm of danger. The man would come back. Grace lay near the fire, her body coiled. Her eyes never left the door. Jack had already checked the locks, twice. He'd even dragged a cabinet across the back entrance. The rifle leaned in the corner. Loaded. Clean. Ready. Snow and Ash, thankfully, remained unaware. They played near Grace's paws, tumbling over each other with squeaks of joy and miniature barks. Innocent. Unburdened. But Grace kept glancing toward the windows between every movement, her ears twitching at each sound. She was alert, not anxious, not panicked, but ready. And that scared Jack more than anything. Because it meant she knew. Late morning, Jack decided to do what he should have done the first time. He drove to the sheriff's office in town. Deputy Miller greeted him at the desk. Her uniform was crisp, her expression sharper than usual. "We've been keeping an eye on your property line," she said. "Haven't seen anything unusual." "You didn't see the man I saw," Jack said. "He came right up to my porch last night. Said the dog was his. Carried a rope like he was gonna drag her back into hell." Miller frowned. "Did he threaten you?" Jack hesitated. "He didn't say the words. But I've seen enough standoffs in my time to know what a threat looks like." Miller stood straighter. "Describe him." Jack did. Age, build, tone of voice, that dark, oil-stained jacket. Miller wrote it all down. "We'll dig," she promised. "Run the description through some of our past cruelty reports. If he's hurt animals before, odds are we've got a file." "Thank you," Jack said. But his voice was tight. Because he knew it wouldn't stop the man. He wasn't the kind to file permits. He was the kind to take what he believed belonged to him, no matter the cost. When Jack returned to the cabin, Grace met him at the door. Her body relaxed slightly when she saw it was him. Snow barked once and ran in circles around his boots. Ash followed, tongue out, tail wagging like a metronome. Jack knelt down, burying his face briefly in Snow's fur. The pup yipped in surprise, then licked his nose. "Everything's fine," Jack whispered. "I won't let anyone touch you." The days that followed passed in a haze of waiting. Jack installed new locks. Put motion sensors near the tree line. Set up trail cams with the help of a ranger buddy he'd called in from the next county. Every night, he sat with Grace by the window. Every shadow outside felt too long. Every rustle of branches turned his stomach. And Grace, she stayed vigilant. But then something changed. One night, after the pups had fallen asleep and the fire burned low, Grace crawled toward Jack. She didn't lay near the pups. She didn't pace the door. She rested her head against his knee. Jack froze. It was the first time she had sought comfort. Not food. Not shelter. Comfort. He set the rifle down, slowly stroked her head, and whispered, "You're not alone anymore." She closed her eyes and stayed like that for nearly an hour. Whatever had happened in her past, whatever ghosts followed her, she was finally beginning to let them go. But ghosts have a habit of returning. 2 nights later they did. It was past midnight. Jack sat on the floor, sipping lukewarm coffee, when Grace suddenly shot up, ears sharp, body rigid. A low, continuous growl vibrated in her throat. Then Jack heard it. Crunching snow. Footsteps. Slow. Purposeful. Jack reached for the rifle, heart pounding. He moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside just a sliver. There he was. The man. Closer than before. He was walking up the path, not sneaking now. Confident. A silhouette against the pale light of the moon. His jacket flapped in the wind. In his hand, again, the rope. Jack opened the door. He didn't step out this time. He stood in the frame. Rifle in plain view. Grace stood beside him, a silent shadow of fury. "Turn around," Jack called. "You come one step closer and I won't just be calling the sheriff, I'll be putting you down myself." The man raised his free hand. I'm not here to hurt anyone. You were never here for a conversation. She's mine, the man said again. She ran. She's damaged. But she's mine. Jack's finger hovered over the trigger. She is not a thing you own. She's not coming back with you. She's just a dog, old man. No, Jack said. She's a mother. And she's family. And if you think I'm going to let you lay one more hand on her, you've misjudged everything. The man's eyes narrowed. He took a slow step forward. Grace let out a roar of a bark, leaping onto the porch with Jack's command still echoing. Stay. The man stopped. He looked at her. And something flickered in his expression. Fear. Recognition. Jack saw it too. This wasn't the face of someone who wanted his property back. This was someone who knew what Grace was capable of now. He dropped the rope. She's not what you think, he hissed. You're making a mistake. Jack stepped forward, rifle raised. No. You did. And with that, the man turned and vanished into the dark. Jack didn't sleep the rest of the night. Neither did Grace. But they stayed side by side on the porch until dawn. And when the morning came, and the sun broke through the woods, Jack looked at Grace and whispered the words he meant with every fiber of his being. You're safe now. Grace didn't move. She just leaned into him. She believed it now. Not because of the locks. Not because of the rifle. But because she finally knew. She belonged. The woods were quiet again. Not the tense, watchful kind of quiet that had haunted the last few weeks, but something softer, earned. It was the hush that comes after a storm has passed and nothing was taken. The kind that tells you, just maybe, you've made it to the other side. Jack stood on the porch, arms crossed, eyes scanning the forest line like he'd done every morning since that final confrontation. The rope the man had dropped still hung on a nail beside the door. Not as a warning. As a reminder. Some battles don't need to be fought twice. Inside the cabin, Grace was sleeping, really sleeping, on her side, stretched out in the dog bed, her breathing deep and peaceful. Her body no longer curled in defensive tension, no longer braced for the past to return. Snow and Ash were nestled beside her, little bellies full, paws twitching in their dreams. Jack walked back inside, boots quiet on the floorboards. He paused to watch them. There was a time not long ago when he wasn't sure they'd all make it. When Grace had shown up in the storm, skeletal and shaking, the pups barely clinging to life, he'd thought it was a miracle they survived the night. Now it was spring. Subtle signs at first. Melted snow revealing patches of muddy earth. Birdsong returning to the mornings. The river beyond the hill began to thaw and run again, its sound drifting into the cabin at night like a lullaby. With the change of season came changes inside too. Jack built a fenced enclosure just off the porch. It wasn't much, but it gave Snow and Ash room to run wild under Grace's watchful eye. He installed a doggy door, reinforced and safe, so they could come and go freely. The pups had outgrown the towel nest and now spent their days wrestling, exploring, and occasionally napping in sunbeams like royalty. Ash grew fast, his paws comically large, his bark deepening with every week. He was brave but cautious, always trailing behind Grace, mimicking her every move. Snow was the spark. Fearless. Fiercely independent. She was the first to try everything. The first to leap off the porch, the first to chase a falling leaf, the first to bark at a bird like it had challenged her to a duel. Grace took it all in stride. She was still watchful, still keen to every sound, but she no longer flinched at shadows. She'd gained weight, her coat gleamed under the sun, and her eyes, those amber eyes, were calm now. Proud. Sometimes Jack would catch her watching the pups play and see something like wonder in her expression, as if she couldn't believe they had made it either. And Jack had changed too. He didn't retreat to the chair as much anymore. He didn't sit in silence staring at the fire like he used to. He was in the yard building things. He was at the kitchen table, writing. He was on the floor, laughing at Pups who stole his socks and ran like they'd conquered an empire. He was alive in a way he hadn't been in years. One afternoon, the doorbell rang. It startled all of them. Jack stood slowly, instinct twitching, but when he opened the door, it was Deputy Miller. She nodded politely. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Jack said, stepping aside. She glanced around the cabin, eyes landing on Grace, who rose to her feet but didn't growl. She simply stood tall, her body between Miller and the pups, calm but protective. "She's different," Miller said. "She's home," Jack replied. Miller smiled. "Good news. We found him." Jack's shoulders stiffened. "Your visitor," she clarified. "Tracked him down. Name's Brett Fallon. Used to run a puppy mill operation 2 towns over. Busted twice. No conviction either time. No surprise he didn't file any missing pet report. Are charges coming?" Miller's smile faded. "We're working on it. He's got a history, but nothing recent enough to stick. Still, we've got eyes on him now. And he won't be coming near here again." Jack nodded. "That's enough. I just thought you should know," she said, pausing near the door. "By the way, people in town are talking." "About what?" She looked at Grace. "About the man who saved a mother and her babies during a storm. About the firefighter who came out of retirement to protect a dog." Jack chuckled dryly. "I didn't save her. She found me." Miller looked at him with something like respect. "Either way, you're both better off now." That night, Jack sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. Grace lay beside him, Ash curled up at her feet, Snow chewing on a stick she clearly thought was a dragon in disguise. The sky was pink and gold. The trees whispered. Jack reached down and scratched behind Grace's ears. "You did good, girl." She tilted her head into his hand. "You survived." Grace looked at him with those soft, wise eyes, and Jack felt it again. The thing he hadn't been able to name for weeks. Healing. It hadn't just been her. He was healing too. For years, Jack had lived in silence, convinced that the best parts of his life had already burned away. That what was left was just ash and waiting. But then a knock came at the door. And behind it, Grace. She had brought her wounds, her fear, her pain. And somehow, in giving her shelter, Jack had given himself the same. Purpose. Love. Family. Weeks later, Jack took the pups into town for their first official vet visit since their emergency arrival. They were strong now, tails high, paws too big for their bodies. The staff greeted them with cheers and treats. On the way out, a young boy stared at the dogs in awe. Jack knelt beside him and whispered, "They started life in a snowstorm. But look at them now." The boy nodded seriously. "They're heroes." "Yeah," Jack said softly. "They are." Back at the cabin, Grace sat on the porch, watching the trail. When she saw them coming, she stood and barked once, loud, clear, and full of life. Ash barked back. Snow ran ahead, kicking up dirt. Jack smiled as he climbed the steps. He had built a life in this cabin, one of silence and solitude. But what he had now was something far more powerful. Grace. Snow. Ash. They weren't just guests. They were the story. And it was only just beginning.